I recently bought a 1950s South Bend lathe. She's a beast of a tool, but I can't just fire her up because I need to bolt the motor mount behind the lathe. So I need to make a tabletop to secure the lathe and motor mount to. My design for the table is simple. I need a flat piece of metal with some structure under it to help brace and keep it from eating fingers when it's moved. I'll make the legs for the table some other time. Right now, I just want to get the lathe mounted and running. The bracing needs to not interfere with the bolt pattern of the lathe and motor mount while also distributing the weight evenly. This is the pattern I came up with. I decided to brace the table with 2-inch box tubing like this. I welded the brace together almost perfectly, with the exception of one stem where I relearned how important it is to clamp your work down. Ah well, grinders remedy a litany of errors. I might need a lot of grinders. For the tabletop, I bought a sheet of 1/4-inch steel plate from a scrapyard. I couldn't find a piece close enough to the size, so I had them cut me one. Maybe it was the heat of the day, but somehow I managed to give them the wrong measurements. With a grinder, I cleaned off the surface rust and smoothed the edges a bit. Apparently, oxyacetylene cutting is a wobbly, messy business. Because I gave them the wrong measurements, I needed to extend one side of the tabletop a bit, so I bought a 36 by 2-inch piece to weld onto the side. I grabbed a 3/8-inch thickness the first time, but I got it right the second time. At least I have some nice stock now. Welding on the extension didn't go as planned. Penetration was poor and I kept seeing contamination in the weld. Turned out I needed to clean the tabletop better and use 240 instead of 120 AC. I just can't dry clothes and weld at the same time now. With the penetration and contamination issues fixed, the extension welding went swimmingly. After welding both sides of the joint, I grinded it nearly flat. Why not all the way flat? I'm lazy, I guess. Anyway, close enough is good enough for this build. After a test fit, it was time to weld the brace onto the back of the tabletop. It's not perfect, but it is stable enough for my needs. Everything was now in place to mount up the lathe on the table. That starts with drilling mounting holes in the table. Confession time. I relearned 2 things during this step. First, I realized how useful cutting fluid is when drilling big holes in steel. Second, I'm terrible at drilling holes in the right places.
How'd I get that so goddamn wrong?
I mean, look at how far off this hole is. It's nearly off by half the diameter of the drill bit. This mistake was rather discouraging. I spent weeks making a decent tabletop just to mess it up in a few minutes of bad marking and drilling. With a bit of widening and minimal swear words, I got the holes lined up enough to fit the bolts, and the lathe was finally mounted to the table. The motor mount went on with fewer mistakes. It hangs over the side, but its 2 bolts will hold it good enough. To complete the build, I needed to run a belt from the flywheel to the headstock, and I definitely did not need to look up those terms. I found a serpentine belt on eBay for $7, and I figured I might as well give that a try. Maybe the lathe is old, or maybe I'm just kind of bad at this, but I could not get the headstock axles disassembled for the life of me. So instead, I split the belt into 2 layers to glue back together on the lathe. This cut is called skiving, in case anyone wanted to know. I glued the belt together with super glue, and it actually held. The glue held, that is. My razor blade skiving job weakened the belt, causing it to split as soon as I put the chuck on the headstock. And no amount of glue could save it. With the death of Serpentine I, I was forced to buy a proper belt. I custom ordered this belt from Albino Belts in Pennsylvania. It comes pre-skived with the 2-part glue to hold it together. After 24 hours of curing, the moment of truth arrived. The belt worked like a champ. Testing the belt led me to a new realization. The chuck was spinning backwards. No worries, the motor has a switch to reverse the direction, which instead trips the breaker. Note to self, when an outlet goes out, try the ground fault interrupt before trying every circuit breaker in the house. To try to understand what was wrong with the motor, I first pulled apart the switch, mostly because it was easier to get open than the motor. Tracing the connections showed the wiring for the reverse direction was grounding out the motor. Ground fault identified. The switch is able to swap two connections when switched to the reverse position, so I rewired it to exchange the hot and neutral leads when put in the reverse position. For the test, I put a power strip with a circuit breaker in between the outlet and the motor. Easier to reset that way. Forward worked, but perplexingly it still spun the motor in reverse. My wiring job should have fixed that. Now to test reverse. If you have an understanding of how AC motors work, then you might be able to guess what happens next. Also, if you've made it this far in the video, I appreciate your attention. Anyway, yeah, you're right. The motor spins in reverse. Well, that's good and that's bad. I'm not tripping any breakers, but I'm still not spinning in the right direction. After some research, I figured out this is a capacitor start AC motor. The very large capacitor is here. These motors have two sets of coils. On startup, both coils work to spin the motor in a particular direction. Then the starter coil turns off while the main coil keeps the motor spinning. Importantly, the spin direction of the motor is effectively determined by the polarity of the starter coil. On industrial motors, there's often a label that indicates which two wires need to be switched in order to reverse the motor. I couldn't find a sticker like that on my motor, whether from age or from it just not being there. I did find a panel with a red and a white wire on spade terminals, so I switched them. Armed with my trusty extension cord circuit breaker, I tried the motor again. And it worked. It only took a litany of mistakes and missteps, but I finally got a working lathe. I turned a piece of aluminum to make sure it worked as intended. Now all I've got to do is learn how to use the thing well. Oh, and get some proper cutting bits for it. And maybe make a tool holder for the open spot on the back of the table. Or maybe add some wheels. Oh, and I've got to make some legs at some point. And